NASA is thrilled to offer this learning series webinar about Culture Track's recent report entitled Untapped Opportunity, Older Americans and the Arts, led by Jen Benoit-Bryan, president of Slover Linett Audience Research. Today's webinar comes close on the heels of NASA's 4-day Creative Aging Institute last month. And as many of you know, NASA has supported 36 of our state and jurisdictional arts agency members as they've made significant progress serving older adults over the last 2 years through our Leveraging State Investments in Creative Aging partnership with E.A. Michelson Philanthropy. As many of you know, NASA's mission is to strengthen state arts agencies. And while our focus is first and foremost on supporting the good work of our members at the state level, from time to time, we're able to convene arts and culture stakeholders, like all of you attending, around important issues in the arts, such as creative aging. We recognize how valuable it is for all of us in the entire arts and culture ecosystem when our practice in the field can be guided and informed by high quality and current research. And so we're very excited to be in dialogue with all of you about your experiences of serving older Americans in your organizations and in your communities. And before we get down to the business of unpacking these new findings about why older Americans represent an untapped opportunity in the field of arts and culture, I am really honored to turn it over to Teresa Bonner, Executive Director of the E.A. Michelson Philanthropy, to hear her thoughts on why this Culture Track report is so valuable for ensuring that older Americans are well served. Teresa, over to you.
Oh, Teresa,
sorry, you're on mute. Teresa, you're still on mute.
I've hit unmute twice. Okay, good. I'm not sure what the problem was, but thank you for letting me know. So again, thank you, Susan and Eric. And on behalf of Ellen Michelson and our staff at E.A. Michelson Philanthropy, I'd like to welcome every one of you and to thank you for joining this important webinar today. When we started our most recent initiative, and I think most of you know that we've been doing work in creative aging for about a decade. But when we started our most recent initiative, which is focused on making creative aging programs endemic in art museums across the United States, one of our consultants, Andras Zanto, urged us to engage with Culture Track in order to better understand and communicate regarding the things that older adults want most, value most, and what they've experienced in their intersections with the arts and culture in our country. E.A. Michelson Philanthropy invested in the project, including the development of a larger data set of older adults and the report that you'll hear about today. It's helped us already. There are many assumptions that we make about older adults. In the case of our work at the foundation, some of those are based on research that was done some time ago, including by Jean Cohen. Many of you are familiar with this, which has helped us understand some of what older adults want. But this project really provides data on older adults and their wishes, as I mentioned, and their desires regarding the arts and culture. So we are really delighted that you're all here to learn about fascinating results of this research. As you know, older adults are a huge and growing sector, and many of the popular assumptions made about older adults are, well, inconsistent with reality, shall we say. The research you'll hear today clearly validates the work you've been doing in the state arts agencies and others in the creative aging space over the last few years, and I know you'll enjoy hearing more. Thanks again, Susan.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Your leadership is a genuine guiding light in this work, and it's always wonderful to have your leadership here with us. Friends, please welcome Jen Benoit-Bryan, president of Slover Linett Audience Research, a firm that uses the tools of research and evaluation to help the cultural sector understand its participants and communities, experiment with new strategies for engagement, and connect more deeply. Over the past few years, Jen has been the principal investigator for the National Culture and Community Research Series, a special edition of Culture Track, and one of the largest studies of cultural behavior conducted in the United States. While at Slover Linett, Jen has worked with a variety of clients across the cultural sector, including the National Academy of Sciences, Museums Moving Forward, Central Park Conservancy, the Kennedy Center, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Carnegie Hall, Washington National Opera, the Metropolitan Opera, and the list goes on and on. Jen holds a PhD in public administration, specializing in research methodology, and we're so grateful that you're here with us today, Jen. Jen's going to present for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take about 10 to 15 minutes for a moderated Q&A at the end of her presentation. And if questions for Jen should arise during her presentation, please go ahead and drop them in the chat, and Eric and I will keep track of them so that when we have our Q&A following her slides, we can hit the ground running with your thoughts. It's a pleasure to be with you today, Jen. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both Susan and Eric for all their help organizing this panel and raising this as a topic. And of course, Teresa and the E.A. Michelson Foundation for the support for this and for really bringing these questions to us. I'm going to throw some slides up here. Can everybody see those? Yes.
Looking good.
Excellent. Thank you. It's always nice to see some heads nodding in confirmation. And I appreciate that lovely introduction from you, Susan. I am really thrilled that there's so much interest in this topic. It's one that we were really delighted to dive into, kind of at the behest of the foundation here. And I think we were surprised at many of the findings. And as a researcher, that's the most fun kind of place to be, when you can confirm some things, but also really be surprised by the data. So I'm delighted to walk you through that and to hear from you about what might be surprising to you in this work. Great. Okay. So during the presentation part of this, which I'll try to keep to 45 minutes, so we have some real time for discussion and questions, I'll share just a little bit about the framing of the study, who we spoke to and how, so you have that context in mind. And then I'll share 4 kind of research finding areas with you that really plug into this idea of untapped potential among older Americans in the arts. The first one is kind of some grounding in the priorities and context of these audiences, really thinking about kind of a lifetime of culture and how we see some trends kind of shifting as different age groups advance through that 55+ population. We'll spend a little time on digital horizons and what that looks like for the older American population in particular. And then talk about some of the calls for change around social issues and what that kind of lens on this data looks like for this population in particular. We'll wrap up with a few insights that we developed in partnership with our team members at LaPlaca-Cohen and through Culture Track that really kind of take these insights and start to think about some of the action areas. And that's a place where I'd love to hear from you about things that you're doing already that might plug into some of these particular findings about the wants, the needs, the behaviors and passions of older Americans. So to give you some framing about the study more broadly, this is a continuation of the Culture Track research that was developed by the team at LaPlaca-Cohen and has been conducted every 2 to 3 years back since 9/11. And with this framework in particular on that research subject, our goal has really been to inform and inspire different approaches to cultural engagement that can be utilized across the spectrum of age that really kind of promote that lifelong connection, learning, and creativity. And in order to do that, we really leveraged this unique kind of approach to research design that we created for the cultural and community versions of Culture Track during COVID. And so during the most recent wave of this work, when we had a study population in total of more than 75,000 Americans participating in this research, we had over a third of those individuals who were more than 55 years old. So 28,300 plus respondents here. in that category. And you can see kind of how they break down by age band here specifically. For that total population, we used a kind of a dual sampling framework. I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of that. We basically used a panel survey in order to get a good sense of the needs and desires to understand Americans in a representative population framework, and then kind of oversampled through the list of arts and culture organizations using weighting to combine those samples back up together into a representative look. And so I think the key kind of takeaway from that is that this data really is reflective of the views of all Americans. We'll be sharing during the slides in just a few minutes some kind of paired observations here that show both the 54 and below population and the 55 plus populations. You can see both sides of that coin and how they compare and contrast. As Teresa mentioned, one of the ways that the foundation supported this work was ensuring that we'd have enough voices at every age band. Knowing that it might be a little harder to reach those in the 75 to 84 and 85 plus through a web survey, we really worked with our panel provider, University of Chicago in ORC, to make sure that we'd have enough voices represented there to be able to make comparisons that would be statistically significant. And then the kind of third design consideration as we were developing this was, how would we want to break down the 55 plus age population? So we had a lot of conversations about, is there some pre-existing framework that we should be connecting to there? Or should we really let the data itself give us some clues about where there might be breaks in that population that would be meaningful? And we really went for that data-driven approach and found that remarkably, there are some real differences in kind of the perspectives, the values, the behaviors of older Americans that line up nicely with these kind of 9 to 10-year age bands. We did put 85 plus all together, but for the most part, we're using these 10-year age bands and have 4 kind of age categories within that 55 plus population that we can refer to. Just to give you a visual on this group, throughout our slides, we'll be using this bright pink color to kind of connote the 55 plus population and this dark blue to do the comparisons to the less than 55 population. And so you can see that there are some differences in terms of demographics, by income, by education level, a little more suburban for the 55 plus population, nothing too surprising there. And we also included a breakdown of what this comparison looked like by region of the country, so you can take a look at that. The other interesting finding here, which I think once we started to unpack it, it made a lot of sense to us, was the kind of decreasing diversity of the age bands as the population got older that we were looking at specifically here. And so we have charted this out so you can get a nice visual of what this looks like. And this is very well aligned with the census in terms of the distribution by race and ethnicity across different age bands within the United States. And it's kind of a punch in the gut really to see how stark kind of what effectively are disparities in length of life for different age groups kind of actualizing in this data set here. But I think it's important to keep in mind as we walk through the findings that really do break down by age ranges, specifically by these 10-year age bands, and of who is made up within those age bands. So I wanted to share it here, both so that, just so that we're all aware of the fact that race and ethnicity varies pretty significantly from age band to age band as we proceed up that group from 55 plus. We've also included gender identity here, which is relatively similar across the 55 plus, less than 55 population. So nothing huge there, but just so you get a sense of kind of who we're talking about and who we heard from in this data. So we'll dive into the actual findings themselves now, although of course I welcome any questions, any comments around methodology, happy to speak to that. Oh, there we go. So some broad priorities and context first, kind of get our feet on the ground. I thought it would be fun to do a little bit of interactivity here. And so I've actually developed 2 poll questions, and we're going to start off with one. We'll show you the results from this once they're completed, but I would love to have you take a guess at what you think the answers might be, what you think we might have heard from Americans here. And so what this poll question is asking you to think about, compared to life before the pandemic, which of these emotions do you expect older adults feel more strongly compared to prior to the pandemic than younger adults? And I'll have you select any that you think apply here. And we'll give you just a minute or so to respond to that before we put up the answers there. Thank you for participating. It's always nice to see kind of what people are expecting here. It looks like disconnected is in the lead, sad or depressed. Worried or afraid is edging up, a little bit lower for bored, angry, and hopeful. All right, I think maybe we give it just another second or two. Actually, if you want to, you can leave it up. I'll go ahead and show you the answers. All right, Eric, let's go ahead and close it out. All right, so our top answer was disconnected, followed by worried or afraid, sad or depressed, angry, and then bored. And what we saw in the data, I think was really remarkable, that there's some real resilience among this 55+ population. And so you're not wrong. There were people age 55 and over who felt all of these emotions to a greater extent than prior to the pandemic. But when we compare the 55+ population to those below the age of 55, we actually see that the only emotion where the 55+ are feeling it more intensively than their younger kind of comparison group is in hopefulness, which I think is just such a nice note to be on here, that while most Americans in both age categories are feeling more disconnected during COVID, I think many of us can really empathize with that. That feeling was concentrated a little bit more in the under 55s than in the over 55. And in fact, we see some pretty big gaps in terms of angry, just 22% of the 55 and over population compared to 34% of those under 55. I think there's a real sense of resilience and kind of perspective that age might bring when navigating some of these really unprecedented kind of events and times like COVID. So thanks for participating in that. We'll have one more poll coming up later, so you can prep for that. I did raise this as a poll question in part because it surprised all of us, and I wondered if it would surprise you, so I appreciate your patience with me there. We also asked about, just not even within an arts and culture context, but just broadly, like what kinds of things do you need more of? Do you want more of in your life right now? And I think it's interesting to see that fun is at the top of the list for both age groups that we're comparing here, that 55+ and under 55, with more than half of each group saying that that's really what they need more of. After that top category, though, things switch around a little bit between the younger and the older respondents. We see that older adults particularly are looking for that kind of social connection opportunity to connect with others in their daily lives, as well as to find humor in their situations, whereas younger adults are a little more likely to be looking for something outside the norm, like adventure. Calm and stability show up in both of their lists, interestingly. That social connection is a place where the kind of needs or desires of older Americans is particularly high compared to younger Americans. And we unpacked that a little bit further and found this really interesting, very linear kind of growth in desire for social connection by those age bands. So it starts with the less than 55 at about a third of people who selected it, and goes up to almost double that when you get to the 85+ group with pretty stepwise progressions. We were unpacking what some of this might mean. We did hear from some people that this big jump from 41% to 54% between the 65 to 74 and the 75 to 84 range might have something to do with retirement and the extent to which you might be connecting socially with people in a work environment, how much you might be looking for that more in your life, depending on what that retirement factor might be for you. Okay, so we'll shift over to the lifetime of culture theme of topics here. There's a really interesting one here about kind of the reasons for the creative activities in people's lives. So the desire to create, what knowing that almost all Americans in both of these age groups had done some kind of personal creative activity over the past year, we were curious to understand why. What are the reasons that they're engaging in personal creative activities? We found that the motivations for that do tend to change a little bit in terms of their order with age. Relaxation was a top reason for older Americans to be engaging in creative activities. Fun was at the top of the list for the younger Americans. Those are both top two, but we do see some different things emerge a little bit further down the list. The sense of accomplishment, I think, is interesting. That's almost half of older Americans. It's a much smaller proportion of younger Americans. And this sense of artistic pride, I feel like those two may go hand in hand for some people, that emerges for that 55 plus audience group. There's also a sense of really wanting to improve skills here, which is consistent across age bands, but really emerges as one of the primary reasons. And I think there are certainly some people who kind of dabble across a lot of different mediums, are looking for something new and how to broaden their perspectives and their practice, and others who look to kind of deepen it. And there are a few places in this survey where we see a preference for that deepening of engagement and a sense of the accomplishment that can come along with it, kind of emerging for this 55 plus group in particular. And that sense of accomplishment is one that tends to grow. The desire, the kind of reason for engaging in creative activities, being this sense of accomplishment, is one that grows as we get older. It's not a perfectly linear curve. We see a little bit of drop off at the 85 plus age group, but still a pretty clear progression of importance and kind of rationale for why we connect with and why we engage in creative activities as we age. One finding that I think is also quite interesting and was a little bit surprising to us was the fact that while there is a little bit of variation in what kinds of activities people are experiencing that connect to culture, there's not huge differences. We didn't see like a really different top 5 list for older Americans and younger Americans here. I would say that some of the activities you might typically think of as family activities, like parks, zoos, and aquariums, are a little bit lower among that 55 plus group. Musical performance is a little bit higher, but our main takeaway after looking at 20 plus kind of categories of cultural activity is that there actually aren't very big differences when it comes to age, that older and younger adults really are choosing to participate for the most part in very similar kinds of activities. And how are they connecting to those activities? I think we were very curious to see what the digital landscape looked like for older Americans specifically, knowing that there can be some additional technological barriers to engagement and connection there. And what we found was that over half of Americans ages 55 and over had participated in some kind of online arts or culture activity or event over the past year, which I think is great. It's not that much higher than among Americans overall, but that we do see this kind of declining, again, a real linear relationship between age band and likelihood of having participated in an online art culture activity, which goes from 68% at that under 55 group down to 52% at the 85 plus group. So I'd say that, that's a span of 16 percentage points. It's not huge, maybe not as large as I might have anticipated. I'd be curious to hear if this reflects your experience or if this is a surprising finding to you as well. Okay, so we have our second poll question here. This one kind of reflects, we talked through some of the benefits that people were getting from those personal creative activities. And this time I'd love to have you reflect on what you think older Americans are most getting from their online engagement with arts and culture. So I'm gonna have you pick your top 3, and Eric is gonna launch our poll. Thank you, Eric. I know there's a lot to kind of look at, so I'm gonna give it a minute and let you take a second to kind of pick which 3 you think are most driving the kind of online engagement with arts and culture that older Americans have. It's clear that people have been listening because I see connection with others as a high one. That's something we heard people really missed in their lives generally. And learning something new is trending very high too. Interesting. Looks like we have improved their skills twice, so we can just add those together. Sorry about that. All right, we'll give it another 10 seconds. Wow, 105 people picked connection with others. That's huge. Okay, Eric, let's go ahead and close it. All right, so connection with others was the lead by far. It looks like followed by learning something new and fun. Excellent. All right, let's take a look at what we heard. Very aligned here. So connection with others is a little bit further down the list, although something valued by a third of older Americans. Learning something new is really at the top of the list for this online arts and culture activities category, which I find really interesting. It's a little bit lower for those who are under the age of 55. Fun still shows up on this list, as well as relaxation. I think there's some common kind of just general reasons for arts and culture participation, no matter the format. Broadening my perspective is one that shows up on the list for 55 plus, but isn't on the top 5 for those under 55. And then again, that connection with others still pulls through. We have in some of the open-ended responses here, we did hear that there have been some really meaningful ways to connect online around an arts and culture activity, but that's not always a possibility. And I don't know, in a format like this, like a webinar where not everybody gets a chance to talk and connect, that sense of connection is not as fostered as it is in other smaller group environments. So it may be not so much that they aren't seeking that, but they may not be finding it as much, because this is about what they actually got out of doing those online arts and culture activities. So I think you guys aren't wrong in that people want that, clearly want more of that in their lives, especially as they age further up those age bands, but may not be something that they're yet getting as much out of these online arts and culture activities. Great, thanks again for participating in them. So this new kind of theme of learning something new that emerged in this online kind of context of arts and culture activities is an interesting one. We really found that for Americans as they age, this sense of newness, of wanting opportunities to learn and to grow became increasingly important and became something that they're increasingly getting out of these online arts and culture activities. It's exciting to see what that looks like. As a researcher, of course, I jump to the next question here, and I'm really curious about what counts as learning something new. How are people learning things? What kinds of things are they wanting to learn? A whole new set of questions and research agendas, but would love to hear from you again about any examples of ways that you might be fostering learning through programs or ways that you've seen that happening through grantee programs. So as we think about how to influence and increase opportunities for engagement with older Americans, there are a few themes that really came up in terms of ways that we could foster or support that. And not too surprisingly, making content accessible without a cost is at the top of the list. We heard from 70% of older Americans that it's really important to them that digital activities are free. It's a little bit lower for younger adults, 67%, but still valued by the majority of people. We also asked a series of questions about how online engagement might be valuable in the ways that it connects us. And we asked about different levels of geography. So one that we asked about was globally, right? The extent to which online engagement offers you the opportunity to access organizations or artists that are located in other places you might not be able to connect with otherwise. And saw this was huge among older Americans, specifically over 2/3, telling us that's really important. It's about 10% lower for younger adults at 59%. Was a little less important, sort of staying, this isn't actually on the slide, but staying within this theme for a second, was less important to have online engagement opportunities that connect them locally, knowing that some people couldn't go out, didn't feel safe going out. We asked about that, and that came in the 30 to 40% range, or also kind of at similar levels, we asked whether or not it was important that online activities connect older Americans with organizations they might have existing relationships with, they may have attended previously, and found pretty similar percentages in the 30 to 40% range there. So this ability to kind of transcend your local geography and connect outside of it is something that's much more broadly appealing to people, Although there is still a sizable cohort who's excited about the opportunity to reconnect locally or to connect with organizations they already know and love. And then the third theme that we've included on this slide is about that social access. So the theme that many of you selected when it came to what people were getting out of online arts and culture activities. We heard from older Americans that it's pretty important that online activities include some kind of social component that gives them a chance to connect with other people. 44% of older adults selected this. It's about the same, it's actually 45% for younger adults. So something that's pretty universally valued during this time when disconnection is kind of the, a top kind of emotion that people are feeling compared to pre-pandemic. Great. Okay, so I'm going to shift over into the final section here, which is about calls for change and kind of social action and social programs. There's some interesting results here. In terms of what kinds of social issues matter most, we see that 3/4 of all adults really believe that arts and culture organizations have a responsibility to confront social issues, to be addressing social issues, and that systemic racism is at the top of that list. Older adults also really saw a greater role for these organizations to be playing in bridging political division specifically. So looking again at these bars where we can compare the 55 plus to the under 55 group here, I think it's interesting to note that for most of them, we see that the 55 plus comes in a little bit less than the under 55 population in terms of believing that there should be, that issue should be addressed through arts and culture organizations. The exception there, I think, is the political division in the United States. I'm not sure why that is, why that issue in particular feels more, just more aligned with what arts and culture organizations could be doing, or potentially feels more salient to older Americans in particular here. So we're going to unpack systemic racial injustice through a number of additional slides, but just wanted to kind of share this. There are some additional issues that we asked about. They don't all fit on this presentation. So if you're interested in more of this, it is included in the full report. I have full data tables. So just let me know if you'd like a little more granularity or detail on the issues we asked about. But turning to this dive into perceptions of systemic racism, we did ask individuals, I think, a pretty hard question to answer here, but one that people really did their best, and most people completed, which is just asking them to think about, based on what they've seen or heard, whether or not they think systemic racism is present in each of the types of organizations below. It's kind of a tricky question because most people think of, it's easier to rate a specific organization, like my local orchestra, than it is to rate all orchestras. And when we tested this question, we heard from people that this was a cognitively taxing question. So we actually only had 4 of these options appear randomly. They didn't have to rate every single one of them, which was great. But we do see some interesting patterns when we unpack the data by age here that are pretty clear, that the perceptions of systemic racism are higher among the greater than 55 population than they are among perceptions of systemic racism are lower among the 55 and over population than they are among the under 55 population. And by a relatively consistent margin, it doesn't seem like there's one genre or a couple of genres that are driving this, that just generally people think that those experiences, that the presence of systemic racism is less likely if they are in that 55 and over population. And I just want to remind you back to that slide that we showed about the demographic makeup of the different less than 55 and 55 plus age bands here. We see really huge differences in responses to this questions for some racial and ethnic groups. Among Black or African Americans in particular, when we put all the data back together and we look at Black and African Americans, we see way higher rates of perceptions of systemic racism here, also among Hispanic and Latinx Americans. And so I think there's a bit of a confound happening here between age and race, where there's there's more white people in the 55 and over population than there is in the under 55 population. And that's probably influencing some of the perceptions here, just to kind of unpack a little bit more about what we think is happening in this data. When we pivot over to values and qualities, we see some real alignment here in terms of the hopes for the future of the arts and culture section, of the arts and culture sector with respect to kind of values and qualities. And so even though there's some difference in perceptions of where arts and culture organizations are currently, the kind of values that those under and over the age of 55 want to see reflected in arts and culture organizations are pretty aligned. And that's really kind of headed by the value of being welcoming to all kinds of people, where we see the 55 plus population a little higher than the under 55 population, almost 2/3 of them. And then some additional values that trail a little bit behind. Diversity of perspectives is fairly close between these two, 31% among 55 plus and 35% among those under the age of 55. We see that preservation of heritage or culture comes up a little bit higher among the 55 plus population, but generally we're seeing really good alignment and that just Americans overall want to see arts and culture organizations really upholding and emphasizing welcome, inclusion, accessibility here. And then my last data slide here is a broad one that really is about kind of co-creating change. And we've got two statistics here that I've pulled out where we asked people just the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with some statements. The first one really focuses on the extent of hope that arts and culture organizations will change after the pandemic to be more relevant to more people. And regardless of age range here, we got the same result. More than half, at 53%, really told us that they strongly agreed with this statement that of hope for change, and not just change generally, but change towards relevance for more people. We also saw a little bit higher interest among older Americans at 63% in wanting to have communities really collaborate with arts and culture organizations in order to create programs. So a desire both for change towards relevance and a desire for more co-creation of programming with communities, not just for them, but with them. And I think those two statistics in combination are really exciting ones. And I hope, I think that they reflect a lot of the work that's already being done. I hope that they can be kind of directional in their focus for organizations that are looking to change towards more relevance. So just a few kind of takeaway insights that I have. These are by no means the only ones. And again, they were kind of developed with this team at Culture Track and with our colleagues at LaPlaca Cohen. But I want to say that there are so many different directions that you could take out of this data. And so would love to have you build on or question some of these takeaways. But before I share those, just wanted to just note the fact that we really believe that the impact of this kind of research lies in these conversations, in the kind of priorities that it can shift or the experiments that it can spark in cultural practice, philanthropy, and policy. And we can't do that on our own. We really appreciate you all being here and being part of this conversation and just an opportunity to think and reflect about what we heard from these Americans who gave their time to participate here and share their thoughts and what it can mean going forward. So a couple of these takeaways, you saw at multiple points throughout this kind of highlights reel presentation of some of the findings, the idea of social connection really coming through. And it was great to see that that came up as one of the top kind of outcomes of online engagement that you all predicted. It's clear that especially as you continue to age through that 55 plus kind of age bands up towards the 85 plus band, that desire for social connection and that feeling of disconnection are more important, more viscerally felt. And so really thinking about and asking, what gives you that sense of social connection? How do we make sure that there's room for that before a program, during a program, after a program? What does it look like online? What does it feel like? How do we make sure that we can foster it? Those are all really good questions to be talking to grantees and to the people you're engaging through your programming with. In a similar vein, we saw such interesting and distinct desires to deepen skills and feel a sense of accomplishment emerging. And again, in a way that really builds as you advance through the different bands of age in that 55 plus population. And so I think there may be opportunities to think about a series of programs that may introduce people to a topic, but then also deepen skills in that topic, having some sense of kind of where there are goals to be established, even in a kind of an arts and culture or creative context. What does that look like to have some goals and to meet those milestones or exceed them for people who are participating in programs? Would be great to talk about. And again, having conversations with people about where and how they feel that sense of accomplishment or what kind of skills they want to deepen would be great here. We'd love to see organizations continuing to connect online. I've been heartened as we've been emerging from the pandemic. I don't know when we will have emerged. It feels like we're still very much in it in a lot of ways, but as our relationship to the pandemic is shifting, continuing to connect online feels important. We know that more than half of older Americans have been doing online arts and culture activities recently. And in research recently that's been put out by Wolf Brown, their Audience Outlook Monitor, you can see that those who are not yet re-engaging in person are disproportionately older Americans too. That's research conducted since this culture track research, but I think it underscores the sense that even if some people are going out and engaging in arts and culture online, that's not true for everyone, and perhaps most so for older Americans. Supporting lifetime learning, that's another theme that really came through here as a clear motivator, particularly for the kind of personal creative activities and for that online engagement. That lifetime learning was something that came through really clearly in terms of what people are getting out of their online engagement. It's exciting to see that happening here. And then the last kind of takeaway here is just to think about what it might look like to incorporate social issues into programming, knowing that they're really thinking about political division and systemic racism were the themes that came up most commonly among older Americans. What does it look like to engage with those issues through programming in a variety of different contexts? I think we as a sector have some really great examples of what that looks like in particular contexts, but maybe not the widest breadth of examples that have been developed yet. So learning from each other about what's working and sharing out when you do find something that works well, I think would be a benefit to everyone. Okay, I'm gonna pause here and just check in with Susan to see if there are any questions that have come in that I can address. But please feel free to type questions in. I'd love having this be more of a dialogue, so appreciate anyone who has submitted a question.
Yes, Jen, thank you so much. I have like 3 pages of notes and some curiosities of my own, but there are definitely a couple of questions that have come in, and I see more happening in the chat. Let me go back to some ones that I saw come in first. That as we're thinking about social change, have to do with that. I saw a question asking in your methodology about were there any questions related to income, disability, living in community or assisted living or nursing homes? Were those older Americans included? And then kind of a follow-up question about things like hearing loss, which may actually deter folks from participating in a study. Were there any accommodations or thoughts to accommodations in terms of how your study was designed and conducted?
Yeah, so we did ask about both income and disability in the survey. We didn't get so granular as to ask about kind of living accommodations or nursing homes or assisted living, although I think that could be a really interesting topic to explore going forward, because I think this hypothesis there's probably a good hypothesis to test there about both access as well as kind of whether or not connections and what people are getting out of their arts and culture experiences might vary based on those particular variables. Would be interesting here. We partnered with NORC at the University of Chicago to distribute the panel version of this survey, and that's where we did the pretty substantial oversample of Americans at the high end of those age bands. And that AmeriSpeak panel does provide options for someone to have an assisted experience by phone or through text in order to provide some additional avenues for completing the survey if the web is not one that is available to someone. So I can connect with them to see I don't actually know how many people took advantage of that accommodation, but that's something I could check on and circle back if there's interest in a little more specificity around what that looked like for this particular survey. I think it's a really, we're always trying to think about accommodation and accessibility for our surveys. We work to make the fonts large, we work to make them accessible across lots of platforms, mobile platforms, and to be accessible for kind of e-readers or those that would read a website out. So all of those were options that were available to people taking this survey.
Well, I really appreciate that answer. I mean, in my own learning curve over the last couple of years, as NASA has been investing more in this work of creative aging, I have really had my mind open to the intersection of ableism and ageism. That's been a big theme that we've been, just seeing and learning more about. So that's really important to know and to realize that there are many accommodations that can be made that help all people participate. And along those lines, another question that came into the chat a little earlier on was the idea about participation and engagement, like what you were actually asking about. Was there any investigation into what folks had participated in versus what they wanted to participate in? In other words, were people getting to do what they want, or were these things that they had to do regardless of preference? And I think for me, that question kind of goes to the heart of what I would say is the ageism conundrum that we face. Mm-hmm. Wondering your answer to that question, and maybe more broadly, were there any surprising findings from the study about ageism and ableism separately or together?
Yeah, I think it's always hard. We want to ask so much. We're curious about so much of people's arts and culture activities and behavior and preferences. We thought it would be most helpful to focus on what people actually did. And so that's really the frame that we used for questions about 4 main categories of culture. So that included the online engagement that we've talked a lot about. That included their in-person engagement prior to COVID. So understanding what were they participating in. It includes also their own personal creative activities during COVID. And there was a huge list. We worked really hard to make that as inclusive as possible, and almost everyone showed up on it. And then the 4th category was about kind of communal arts activities that people might have been involved in during or prior to COVID. So we went for more breadth in terms of the description of people's relationship to and behavior around arts and culture, rather than asking as much about the kind of potential gap or disconnect between what they've been doing and what they might ideally be doing. It would be a really interesting area to explore. I'm curious too to see, especially for online engagement, how much of that engagement is a substitute effect because they can't go in person, they don't feel safe, or they have other barriers to doing that, and how much of that is the actual desire to do that. But I think it could be applied to most of these contexts in really interesting ways.
Thank you for that answer. And I hope that for the folks who chimed in early on that we addressed the curiosities that you brought forward, which really are important considerations in this conversation. Another question for you is about the perception of systemic racism, part of those slides there. Mm-hmm. Wondering whether you were measuring participation or patronage regarding folks' perception of racism.
Yeah, let me jump back to that one. So this is that slide. Oh, you can still see it, right? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we did actually break this out. We were curious to see whether or not people who had actually attended something within this genre within the last few years might have either, we weren't sure, higher or lower perceptions of systemic racism compared to those who had not actually attended. I think, I don't know, I could see it going either way. And what we actually discovered was that those who had been to some performance, show, whatever it is, within this genre, were almost across the board were likely to rate systemic racism as being more present compared to those who are rating it who hadn't been. And I think there is a sense of like, if you haven't been and you're not sure, it's a harder task to kind of say, well, I haven't actually been to a dance performance in the last 5 years, but so I'm going to maybe give them the benefit of the doubt. But if you have been, you might both hold them to account a little bit more. You might have a better grounding in the extent of, in your answer, but you also might think we saw some evidence that people want to see change when they care most about those organizations. And so there's this sense of like, I'm invested in this art form and I want it to be better. I want it to do better. And so I think there may be a little bit of that that's manifesting in people's responses too.
We're just building on these really smart questions that are coming in. A question was, were there equal numbers of polled people in terms of age and race? And this brings me to a question that I had myself in the very beginning when you were talking about methodology, about this study very carefully and thoughtfully being a representative sample of Americans. What is that? I mean, when you're looking at the data, like what is a representative sample? And to this person's question, was there an equal number of folks who were polled in terms of age and race?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's a really tricky one. It's one that like people work on full time, this question, for sure. And it's part of the reason that we worked with the team at NORC, who I will say are very expensive when it comes to panels, but do just an incredible job of this. And so they actually have this amazing system where they have 27 different variables that they use when they develop a population framework. And so that includes many of the things you would expect around geography, around demographics, race, ethnicity, age, education, marital status, gender, all of these things are part of that. And they use that whole framework in order to really ensure that the population is reflective of, the sample that we're using here is reflective of the population as a whole. So that doesn't mean that we pull equal numbers of individuals. It means that we're pulling individuals in proportion to, what they would make up in the population as a whole. And there are, in fact, some people who respond at lower rates than others. And so for those people, we actually increase their numbers a little bit more because we know they're less likely to respond. So they have a lot of, they're really aiming for proportional representation across a pretty wide range of categories, mostly demographics and geographic categories. And there's a great methodology document that goes into a ton of detail on this that I can point people to on our site, or that we can include as part of the recap that goes out afterwards.
I'm really appreciating this kind of line of inquiry from our audience members today, because I think it does speak a little bit to the awareness of systemic racism is also part of how we ask research questions and understand things like that. It's I think a growing awareness of what systemic racism or ableism or ageism might look like is really important. And these questions are giving me a lot of food for thought. It's very, very important.
It is. Sorry, one quick note on this too. We've been asked a lot of times about what does systemic racism mean? And do we expect people to be applying that definition universally? And we did a lot of cognitive testing of these survey questions where we had people kind of take the survey and talk out loud about how they were interpreting it and what was confusing, and found that generally people just kind of think of that as racism. But I do wonder too, going back, whether or not there might be some difference in terms of just how universally used some of these terms are, how familiar some of these terms are by those age bands. That's not something that we got into specifically here. And just as I think about, all the different factors that can be playing into some of the difference in results that we're seeing here, that's another one that I think we would probably do a little differently this time around.
Shifting gears a little bit to a different line of inquiry. There are a couple of comments in our chat here, and I'm going to just kind of bundle them into a bigger one. So forgive me, folks who have written in here if I'm not speaking exactly to your question. But this bundle is really about older adults who are artists, who are makers, who are participating in careers, and who are looking for grant opportunities or looking for professional development in terms of marketing and social media and things that help to develop a career, And I was curious about, I can't remember which slide it was in, but the idea of like engaging in creative activities in your survey, what does that exactly mean? And did it include things like, we did talk, you mentioned a bit about lifelong learning in the arts and folks who are arts learners, but what about Does engaging in creative activities in this report also include active artists who are participating and making a career out of their work and engagement in the arts?
It does, yes, because they're part of the population, right? So they're included here. When we ask this question about the reasons that people are doing personal creative activities, we had a list of like 14 different options that people could select from, which I'm happy to share out. We didn't include to make money. And in hindsight, that would have been a really good one to include, because there have been some questions that have emerged about artists specifically, or for my job would have been great, something along those lines. We did have another reason that people could fill in. And so we did go back into the data set, all 76,000 people, and scanned through that other reason. And we found that about 3% of people included some kind of response that indicated that they professionally had a relationship to the arts, making money, to feed my family, those kinds of responses we all grouped together. And we did a little bit of additional analysis of those responses. And they are distinct. We haven't actually broken those down by age band, which could be an interesting follow-up analysis to really explore here. But it certainly is an important piece. And again, it's so funny how looking back on it, it's really easy to see places where we should be adding things. The nice thing about Culture Track is that it's not a one and done study. We added a bunch of new questions to this second wave that we hadn't included in the first wave, and I think made it more reflective of contemporary issues and questions people had brought up like this. So it's really helpful to have it raised. We can get a good sense of kind of the lower bar of that through these write-ins, but we are careful with that data because some people just aren't going to take the time to write things in. So I don't want to under kind of state what the proportion of that group might be in this population, but would be happy to share a little bit more out about them specifically if that's of interest to anyone. Please I've got my email up here, so don't hesitate to shoot me an email if you're interested in that specifically.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. And before I kick it to you, I just want to thank everyone again who have been participating in the chat. And I'm so sorry that there's never enough time to really bring everything forward, but your voice is heard, and it's really wonderful to have you all participating in this way. Last question for you is, what have you discovered about older adults and the digital divide, and how or if it prohibited access to arts and culture participation?
It's a particularly challenging question, I think, because of the format of this survey being a predominantly online survey. One of the major limitations of this work is that it likely is underreporting those without an internet connection. I will say that NORC's AmeriSpeak panel does a really good job of providing additional paths for people to respond to surveys who might not have an internet connection, but getting a good sense of like who might be missing from this picture because of the digital divide, I think is important just to hold onto. I think within this data, among those who were able to access this survey, I find it notable having points of connection in all of these age ranges. I find it notable that arts and culture engagement online is as high as it is, particularly among those highest age bands of 75 to 84 and the 85 plus. And I think there's real opportunity to explore what that's looking like, how it's happening, and what it's providing for those Americans, that sense of substitution for in-person, a way to remain safe but still connect to passions in life and get the kind of benefits of connection. The arts, culture, and creativity, I think, are ripe for some additional investigation. So I guess I would try to leave it on a hopeful note there with respect to the degree of connection that is happening here, while acknowledging that it is a place where it is a little harder to put the exact numbers to it, just given that we know that there are probably some voices missing here and there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We are right just after 4 o'clock. I cannot imagine a better way to kick off NASA's 2023 Learning Series. It was such an inspiring presentation and a great discussion. Again, thank you for everyone who chimed in the chat. I hope that everybody's leaving with just a renewed sense of purpose and power to make a difference and to connect and serve older Americans in the arts. Please know that, as I mentioned before, we will make this webinar available on NASA's YouTube channel for future reference. Feel free to share it far and wide among your networks and communities. It's really been a pleasure to spend time in community and digital community with you all this afternoon. And just with a final word of thank you to you, Jen, for your presentation, and you, Teresa, for joining us. I want to say good night, everyone. I bid you well and see you next time. Thank you very much.